welcome to another episode of Judge of Character. As always, I'm your host, Steve, and today's a special episode. Why? Because today I'm doing a top 10 list. Why am I doing a top 10 list? Because I'm having a little bit of writer's block with the next character, so this is just some filler until then. But more importantly, it's because I want to share some of my favorites with you. I've said before how, to me at least, characters are the most important element of storytelling. Without characters, we have no real reason to be invested in the story being told. There are multiple types of characters, all serving some sort of purpose. You've got your hero, your villain, your sidekick, and many others. But did you know that there are different subtypes of characters? It's not enough to simply say, oh, he's the hero, or she's the villain. You have to break them down into further categories in order to better understand them. Batman isn't simply a hero. He's an anti-hero. Vito Corleone isn't just a villain. He's a sophisticated villain. Through these subcategories, we begin to have a better understanding of what characters are like, and it makes them more three-dimensional. Having said all that, I can honestly say that my favorite type of character is the villain. After all, villains are what provide the necessary conflict in our stories to create the drama. And of the different types of villains, I can honestly say my favorite is the tragic villain. Your standard villain is the guy who, when they arrive in the story, we automatically boo and hiss at him. We want him to fail, for the hero to triumph over them. But the tragic villain is a character who plays with our expectations. When a tragic villain arrives on the screen, we don't really hate them. In fact, we often find ourselves sympathizing with them. They're not evil for the sake of evil. Maybe they have good intentions, but the methods are all wrong. Tragic villains are one of the best types of characters because of how well-rounded they tend to be. To make a tragic villain work, you have to make them relatable. And this episode is all about tragic villains. Now bear in mind that this is my personal list, and if you don't agree with some of the things on here, that's perfectly fine. That's the whole point of having an opinion. In fact, to use an old southern colloquialism, opinions are like assholes. Everyone's got one, and everyone thinks that everyone else's stinks. Yep, that definitely came from the South. Number 10. Michael Corleone from The Godfather. When people think of The Godfather, they often think of Marlon Brando's Don Vito Corleone. After all, he is the Godfather. But Michael Corleone deserves a mention here, if for no other reason than because he doesn't want to be a Godfather. When we meet him in the original film, Michael wants nothing to do with the family business. He wants to live a normal American life. It's only after an attempt on his father's life that Michael gets involved with the Mafia, and as a result, by the end of the film, Michael is a ruthless Mafia Don. He continues his ways in the next two films, but by the third film, Michael wants to go legit and begins working on dissolving his criminal empire. But despite his attempts to do so, he gets pulled back in, and by the time everything is over, after his daughter Mary is killed by a bullet meant for him, Michael dies alone in Sicily, his life destroyed by his mob ties. The tragedy of Michael Corleone is that he never wanted to be a part of that life. He never wanted anything to do with it. But certain events drove him to it. Despite being a ruthless crime lord who murders off his enemies and is surrounded by blood and death all day long, in the end of the whole story, you just feel sorry for the guy. He's lost his family, he's lost his friends, even though he wanted to be a completely legit guy. Which is why he deserves the number 10 spot on my list. Number 9. Lotso Huggins Bear from Toy Story 3. Now I know some of you might wonder why him, just hear me out. Lotso is the main villain of Toy Story 3, the head toy of the daycare center Woody and the others find themselves trapped in after accidentally being given away. At first he seems like a nice guy, but it quickly becomes apparent that he's a total monster, believing that a child's love for a toy isn't real, and that the very notion of love is something for suckers. It very quickly becomes obvious that Lotso is a near-total monster, if not already a complete one. But then we learn his backstory. It turns out that Lotso, like other toys, had an owner. One day, the child lost Lotso, like a kid does. Eventually, Lotso made his way back, only to find out that his former owner had replaced him with another Lotso.
But by then, it was too late.
This was the moment where Lotso turned and became the monster we know him as. This was his start of darkness, his moral event horizon.
Snapped. She replaced us. Come on.
No, she only replaced you.
She replaced all of us, didn't she?
This moment solidifies his belief about kids and toys, and from there drives his actions. But despite what he does, we do feel some sympathy. Lotso is driven by a horrible experience that completely colored his perception of the world around him. He doesn't realize that the kid replacing him with a doll that was just like him wasn't her abandoning him. If anything, it was a sign of how much she loved her toy, that she was willing to get something that looked just like him. If anything, it was a sign that Lotso abandoned her. Number 8. Davy Jones from Pirates of the Caribbean 2 and 3. Why is Davy Jones a tragic villain? Because he has the face of Cthulhu! I mean, come on, he looks like an elder god. You can't help but feel sorry for a guy like that. Moving on. I suppose I better go into more detail. Davy Jones is one of the main villains of the Pirates franchise and is the captain of the Flying Dutchman. Originally in life, Jones was just another human pirate captain. But one day he fell in love with the sea goddess Calypso. He vowed to serve her by ferrying lost souls to their final resting place in exchange for her love, which could only be fulfilled once every 10 years when he was allowed on land. But on one occasion, she showed him up. So what does he do? Rips out his heart. I'm not even lying. He rips out his heart. He rips his heart out. His still beating heart. A la Indiana Jones in the Temple of Doom. Still beating heart. Puts it in a chest. Actually, when you stop to think about it, sounds like something an emo kid would do. But it gets better. In revenge, he tells the pirate brethren how to imprison Calypso, thereby keeping her locked in mortal form. From there, he proceeds to neglect his duties, instead keeping the souls for himself, and using the Flying Dutchman to terrorize the seas. He changes appearances into Cthulhu's little brother and becomes a major villain in the story. However, despite his actions, we still can't help but feel sorry for the guy. Any one of you out there who's ever been betrayed by a significant other or someone you really cared about knows exactly the kind of pain I'm talking about. Though I would like to think that many of you wouldn't go out on a, terror spree with lost souls. Maybe. It's in moments where Jones is by himself, or with Calypso, that we see the pain he feels. And boy does it hurt. Davy Jones. Ugly as hell. But still a tragic character. Number 7. Dr. Connors from Spider-Man. Longtime fans of the comic book hero will recognize Dr. Curt Connors, aka the Lizard. First introduced in The Amazing Spider-Man number 6, Curt Connors has become one of the more sympathetic villains in Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery, especially depending on which version you're talking about. For the sake of this countdown, I'm going to talk mostly about the version from the recent film The Amazing Spider-Man, featuring Reyes Ifans as the character. Why this version? It seems like this interpretation is slightly more altruistic. Yes, Connors is still making a serum that will regrow limbs, but it's not primarily for him. It seems like in this film, Connors really has the benefit for others in mind more than his own wants. Oh, they're still there, but just not as clearly. In addition to that, when it's hinted that the serum will be tested on humans without his consent, Connors' first instinct is to say no, and when it becomes obvious he doesn't have a choice, he injects it on himself, sparing others the possible problems. And it's a good thing he did. As a result, Connors became the terrible Lizard, a villain who wants to, what else, take over the world. I bet you're expecting that whole M. Bison, of course, joke. You expect too much. The tragedy here is that, when he's human, Connors is actually a decent guy. He really does want to help others, and only took the injection in order to save innocence. He has the best interests in mind and is a brilliant person. For that, you have to respect the guy. But when he turns into the Lizard, his sanity is lost and he becomes a complete monster. It's the moments when he's human that tug at our heartstrings and feel sorry for the poor SOB. And for that, he deserves a spot right here on the list. Number 6. Loki from Thor and the Avengers. You want to talk about the stepchild that nobody loves? Here's your guy. The villain of both Thor and the Avengers, Loki is the younger brother of Thor and the son of Odin. In Thor, Loki starts out as just the trickster brother of, well, Thor. He later finds out that he is not in fact the son of Odin, but rather the son of Laufey, the leader of the Frost Giants, meaning he too is a Frost Giant. This, along with the fact that Loki's never gotten Odin's approval, combine to drive him over the edge and plot to kill his real father in order to get the approval of his adoptive father. Wow! There's better ways to get attention, man! What makes Loki a tragic villain is that all of his plans are spurred by the need to obtain Odin's approval, and therefore his love and affection, something almost all sons want from their fathers. If Odin had simply not been an ass, maybe the whole thing could have been avoided. And what makes it worse is that this isn't limited to just the movie. It's also an actual Norse mythology. Well, maybe not the whole trying to destroy the world bit, but you get my idea. Loki, the poor guy just needed some fatherly attention. Number 5. Darth Vader from Star Wars. That's right, the Sith Lord with the world's most complicated inhaler. First appearing in Star Wars in 1977, Darth Vader at first appears to be the main bad guy, a ruthless Sith Lord hell-bent on conquering the universe. But then we learn that he's actually working for the bad guy who's hell-bent on conquering the universe. Then we learn that he's the father of Luke Skywalker, our hero. Then we learn that he was a good guy. Yes, Darth Vader's fall from grace would make anyone shed a tear. Sorry. Originally born as a slave on Tatooine, Vader was once known as Anakin Skywalker. He's discovered by Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi, warriors known as Jedi. They discover that young Anakin has a high number of midichlorians, bacteria that enables Jedi and Sith to use the Force. And that's all we're going to say about it. If you have an issue with it, take it up with Lucas. He's taken under the wings of Obi-Wan and taught to be a Jedi. But things don't go so well for him, as he's an emotional little dick. Or at least he's supposed to be, kinda hard to tell with Hayden Christensen's acting. He has a lot of fear and hate in him, which only grows after his mother is kidnapped and later dies in his arms. In revenge, he slaughters the persons responsible. Later, determined to keep a prophetic dream involving his wife dying from coming true, he allows himself to be tricked and manipulated by the man who would later be known as the Emperor. Betraying the Jedi, Anakin ends up fighting his former mentor and loses, becoming more machine than man. The Emperor then lies to him, saying that Anakin killed his wife, further sealing his fate as a villain. As well as giving us one of the worst examples of a big no. Vader's fall from grace is a long and tragic one filled with blood and death and destruction. But unlike some of the other villains on this list, he actually gets a moment of redemption when he manages to save his son and kill the Emperor. He may have been a villain for most of the time, but he dies a hero. For that, he deserves the spot on this list. Number 4. The Phantom of the Opera from The Phantom of the Opera. The Phantom of the Opera is one of the most well-known stories told in recent years, and for damn good reason. It's a story that mixes together different genres such as horror and romance and mystery. It's a story of a mysterious figure living in the bowels of an opera house in Paris and how he falls for an innocent little girl and what he'll do to keep her in his grasp. Now, that got kind of dark, didn't it? As a testament to the story, it's been adapted literally over 100 times in numerous mediums, from film to comics and across several genres, including straight horror. As much of this comes from the titular character as the story itself. The Phantom of the Opera, otherwise known as Eric, is a man who lives in the Garnier Opera House, also known as Palais Garnier, and terrorizes its workers and residents, blackmailing the owners into paying him money. One day, he meets the young singer Christine Daae and decides to take her under his wing, teaching her how to sing professionally and furthering her career. He eventually falls in love with her and attempts to take her as his own, against her wishes. Remember, folks, no means no. That's not a joke, I'm being dead serious. No! What makes Eric such a tragic figure comes from his backstory, what little is given. He was born hideously disfigured and was hated by all those around him, even his own mother. Because of his deformity, Eric was forced to live a life of solitude, which allowed him to study and learn all manner of subjects, from music to magic and even construction. By the time he was a grown man, Eric was a genius and could be considered one of the most brilliant men of the times. However, because of his appearance, which made him resemble something of a living corpse, he would forever be relegated to the shadows, uninvolved with the rest of humanity. His isolation has also left him with a slightly childish view on certain things. He doesn't want Christine simply to have sex with her. Rather, he wants her as just a wife, like any other man. For him, it's a way of achieving some level of normalcy. While many fans tend to think of Eric in a more positive light, as in creepily obsessing over him, let us not forget first and foremost that he is a villain. Eric terrorizes the locals, blackmails the owners of the Opera House, kidnaps Christine, and even murders several people in his reign of terror. But once we learn of his past, there's suddenly a tinge of sympathy, and we start feeling sorry for the man. Yes, he's done things that are reprehensible, but considering all that's happened to him, can we really blame him? The tragedy here is that if Eric only looked like any other man out there, he would have been one of the greatest people in history. Instead, he's treated as a monster, and the treatment creates exactly that, a monster. It isn't until Christine shows him genuine affection that he realizes what he's done and has a change of heart, releasing Christine to be with the man she really loves. It's because of all this that Eric gets the number 4 spot on my list. As Christine herself says in the original novel by Gaston Leroux, poor Eric. Yes, poor Eric indeed. But he's still a good choice to dress up as on Halloween. Number 3. Damona from Gargoyles. Now before I go any further on this one, I'd like to take a moment to warn you that, yes, Damona is a tragic villain, but you shouldn't feel too sorry for her. Sympathize with her, yes, but not too much. You'll see why in a minute. Damona from Gargoyles is an example of a villain who's tragic because of how much they've convinced themselves that what they are doing is right. No matter how much we might try to convince them otherwise, they firmly believe that they are the heroes. Damona is a perfect example of this. Her goal is to completely destroy humanity, to wipe them off the map. To this end, she will try anything she can think of. Her goal stems from her belief that humans are responsible for the destruction of her race, when in reality, she's much more responsible than anything or anyone else. Her actions in the series are what leads to the near total extinction of her people, and she's so far deluded in her mind about the truth that she sees herself as some sort of Knight Templar, when in reality, she's just causing pain to others for what she's actually done to herself. Don't you get it yet? It's your fault, you stupid twit! The tragedy here is that there's a small chance that, if she would just open her eyes and see what she's done, she could change and actually become a good person. But alas, this will never happen, as her perception of the world and those around her is so bent out of proportion that there's simply no hope for her, earning her spot here at number 3. In addition to all this, there's one other reason why she's such a bitch. You wanna know? She needs to get laid! Yeah. For true. Number 2. Sweeney Todd from Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street. Now, before I go any further, I'd like to take another moment to point out that there was no historical basis of there ever being a real Sweeney Todd. It's just a myth. Let it go. The main character of both the film and the Sondheim play it's based on, Sweeney Todd is a villain protagonist. He's the guy the story is all about, but he's a murderer who slits his victims' throats and then has his neighbor Mrs. Lovett use the bodies as the main ingredient in her meat pies. Meat pie. But upon learning his past and how he got to where he was, we suddenly find ourselves rooting for the guy, even as we cringe watching him kill people. We learn that Todd was once a normal man with a wife and child whom he loved very much. But a man named Judge Turpin falls for Todd's wife as well, and, using his judicial powers, locks Todd up for a crime he didn't commit. Also, he can take Todd's wife and child as his own. The story begins with Todd's return to London and his determination to try and resume his old life. When he arrives back, he learns from Mrs. Lovett that Turpin raped his wife, who later poisoned herself. Taking this to mean that she was dead, Todd swears revenge and begins to plot to kill him. But the most tragic moment for the character comes right at the end. Have tissue handy. Throughout the course of the story, we often see a crazy woman raving on the streets of London. Near the end, we learn that it is in fact Todd's wife. It turns out that while she did poison herself, it didn't kill her. Instead, it drove her crazy. Lovett decides not to mention this to Todd when they first meet, thinking that she's doing him a favor. In reality, because he didn't know who she really was, Todd slits her throat right before he kills Turpin. Only after her death does he realize what he's done, and when he learns what Lovett did, he brutally murders her by throwing her into an open furnace. The story ends with Todd dead, his own throat slashed by a young man he befriended earlier in the tale. Wow. Simply wow. Todd is a tragic villain because his actions are motivated by revenge, and because his victory is a Pyrrhic one. Yes, he gets his revenge against Judge Turpin, but at a very great cost. He unknowingly murders his wife, his daughter is lost to him for good, to some sailor boy he met, and he dies with his wife's body in his arms. Pretty much ties it all up in a neat little bow, doesn't it? It's a moment where you're practically in tears over the villain. And what could be a better example of a tragic villain? Just one. And my number one tragic villain is Mr. Freeze from Batman. No doubt many of you are going to disagree with me on this one, and that's perfectly fine. Remember what I said at the start of the video, but also hear me out. Mr. Freeze is easily the most tragic villain in Batman's Rogues Gallery, and to me, he's the most tragic villain of all. Although this is largely due in part to the fact that a lot of his actions make me wonder, what would I do if I were in the same situation as him? What would my response be? Mr. Freeze was eventually Victor Freeze, a prominent scientist in the field of cryogenics. We learn that Freeze had a wife named Nora, who was contracted a deadly disease that is slowly killing her. Using his knowledge in freezing technology, Freeze puts Nora in a cryogenic suspension so that he can work on a cure while keeping her alive. But due to a lab accident, Freeze is transformed. Unable to survive in warmer temperatures, including room temperatures, Freeze is forced to live in cold environments and has to wear a cold suit to be anywhere that is warm. Seriously, you'd think scientists would know better than to just leave these dangerous chemicals just lying around everywhere where they can cause these horrible accidents, right? Dubbing himself Mr. Freeze, Victor begins his life of crime. But unlike other criminals who are motivated by things such as greed and power, Mr. Freeze has only one goal: to save his wife. That's it. He doesn't want to take over the world, he doesn't want to be rich, he just wants his wife back. His crimes are basically motivated by the love he has for his wife, and he's determined to do whatever is necessary to save her. This is where the tragedy comes from, and where we begin to sympathize for the guy. Take a moment and ask yourself this question. What would you do if you were in his shoes? Would you do whatever it took to save your loved one? Would you steal for them? Would you even kill for them? Mr. Freeze's place on this list is secured with only one quote.
Think of it, Batman. To never again walk on a summer's day with a hot wind in your face and a warm hand to hold. Oh yes, I'd kill for that.
That, to me, is probably one of the purest forms of a tragic villain out there. And it's why he's my number one pick. And there you have it, folks, my top 10 tragic villains. I hope you enjoyed the countdown, although I'm pretty sure many, if not all of you, are going to disagree with me on certain order of characters. And that's fine. That's perfectly fine. This is just my top 10 list, characters that I believe think best exemplify the idea of the tragic villain. A character that, yeah, they do evil, they do wrong, but we can't bring ourselves to hate them completely. They're tragic villains, you just can't help but feel sorry for them. And that's the point. I'm your host Steve, reminding all of you to stay in character.